Question 3. What does it mean to be progressive? Our goals. We'll understand why reformers worked so hard to fix problems in society during the Gilded Age. We'll consider some important groups and ideas such as the populists, the progressives, the social gospel, workplace safety, child labor, political reform, and environmental conservation. Our big idea. Populists and progressives tried to reform society around the turn of the last century. They focused on fair business practices, education, political reforms, the income tax, aid to the poor, workplace safety, food safety, women's rights, and conservation. Let's get started with our introduction. As you probably have already come to understand, the Gilded Age was a time of extremes. On one hand, there were some Americans who, through their ingenuity and determination, and probably a fair amount of luck, became fabulously rich. On the other hand, there were so many more who struggled every day to earn enough to feed their families. Americans were farmers, but were quickly becoming city dwellers. Amid all this change, reformers worked to improve the lives of those around them. Like the muckrakers, or the progressive presidents, many everyday Americans worked in thousands of small ways to make America a better place. Some worked to improve the lives of farmers, or laborers, or children, or immigrants. Some wanted political change. Others just wanted to help citizens find a job. The people who worked to make that change were known as progressives. What do you think? What does it mean to be progressive?
The populists. Like the oppressed laboring classes of the East, it was only a matter of time before Western farmers would attempt to use their numbers to effect positive change. In 1867, the first such national organization was formed. Led by Oliver Kelly, the Patrons of Husbandry, also known as the Grange, organized to address the social isolation of farm life. Like other secret societies, such as the Masons, Grangers had local chapters with secret passwords and rituals. The local Grange sponsored dances and gatherings to attack the doldrums of daily life. It was only natural that politics and economics were discussed in these settings, and the Grangers soon realized that their individual problems were common. Identifying the railroads as the chief villains, Grangers lobbied state legislatures for regulation of the industry. By 1874, several states passed the Granger laws, establishing maximum shipping rates. Grangers also pooled their resources to buy grain elevators of their own, so that members could enjoy a break on grain storage. Farmers' alliances went a step further. Beginning in 1889, Northern and Southern Farmers' Alliances championed the same issues as the Grangers, but also entered the political arena. Members of these alliances won seats in state legislatures across the Great Plains to strengthen the agrarian voice in politics. What did all the farmers seem to have in common? The answer was simple: debt. Looking for solutions to this condition, farmers began to attack the nation's monetary system. As of 1873, Congress declared that all federal money must be backed by gold. This limited the nation's money supply and benefited the wealthy. The farmers wanted to create inflation. Inflation actually helps debtors. The economics are simple. If a farmer owes $3,000 and can earn $1 for every bushel of wheat sold at harvest, he needs to sell 3,000 bushels to pay off the debt. If inflation could push the price of a bushel of wheat up to $3, he needed to sell only 1,000 bushels. Of course, inflation is bad for the bankers who made the loans. To create inflation, farmers suggested that the money supply be expanded to include dollars not backed by gold. First, farmers attempted to encourage Congress to print greenback dollars like the ones issued during the Civil War. Since the greenbacks were not backed by gold, more dollars could be printed, creating an inflationary effect. The Greenback Party and the Greenback Labor Party each ran candidates for president in 1876, 1880, and 1884 under this platform. No candidate was able to muster national support for the idea and farmers turned to another strategy. Inflation could also be created by printing money that was backed by silver as well as gold. This idea was more popular because people were more confident in their money if they knew it was backed by a precious metal. Also, America had coined money backed by silver until 1873. Out of the ashes of the Greenback Labor Party grew the Populist Party. In addition to demanding the free coinage of silver, the Populists called for a host of other reforms. They demanded a graduated income tax, whereby individuals earning a higher income paid a higher percentage in taxes. They wanted constitutional reforms as well. Up until this point, senators were still not elected by the people directly. They were chosen by state legislatures. The Populists demanded a constitutional amendment allowing for the direct election of senators. They demanded democratic reforms, such as the initiative, where citizens could directly introduce debate on a topic in the legislatures. The referendum would allow citizens, rather than their representatives, to vote a proposed law. Recall would allow the people to end an elected official's term before it expired. They also called for the secret ballot and a one-term limit for the president. In 1892, the Populists ran James Weaver for president on this ambitious platform. He polled over 1 million popular votes and 22 electoral votes. Although he came far short of victory, populist ideas gained traction at the national level. When the financial panic of 1893 hit the following year, an increased number of unemployed and dispossessed Americans gave momentum to the populist movement. A great showdown was in place for 1896. The election of 1896. All the elements for political success seemed to be falling into place for the Populists. James Weaver made an impressive showing in 1892, and populist ideas were being discussed across the nation. The Panic of 1893 was the worst financial crisis to date in American history. As the soup lines grew larger, so did voters' anger. When Jacob S. Coxey of Ohio marched his 200 supporters, dubbed Coxey's Army, into the nation's capital to demand reforms in the spring of 1894, many thought a revolution was brewing. The climate seemed to ache for change. All that the populists needed was a winning presidential candidate in 1896. Ironically, the person who defended the populist platform that year came from the Democratic Party. William Jennings Bryan was the unlikely candidate. An attorney from Lincoln, Nebraska, Bryan's speaking skills were among the best of his generation. Known as the Great Commoner, Bryan developed a reputation as defender of the farmer. When populist ideas began to spread, Democratic voters of the South and West gave enthusiastic endorsement. At the Chicago Democratic Convention in 1896, Bryan delivered a speech that made his career. Demanding the free coinage of silver, Bryan shouted, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Thousands of delegates roared their approval, and at the age of 36, the boy orator received the Democratic nomination. Faced with a difficult choice between surrendering their identity and hurting their own cause, the Populist Party nominated Bryan as their candidate as well, effectively merging the Populist and Democratic parties. The Republican competitor was William McKinley, the governor of Ohio. He had the support of the moneyed Eastern establishment. Behind the scenes, a wealthy Cleveland industrialist named Mark Hanna was determined to see McKinley elected. He, like many of his class, believed that the free coinage of silver would bring financial ruin to America, or at least financial ruin to the pocketbooks of the wealthy. Using his vast resources and power, Hanna directed the campaign based on fear of a Bryan victory. McKinley campaigned from his home, leaving the politicking for the party hacks. Bryan revolutionized campaign politics by launching a nationwide whistle-stop effort, making 20 to 30 speeches per day from the back of a train as it stopped in each town along the rail line. When the results were finally tallied, McKinley beat Bryan by an electoral vote margin of 271 to 176. The popular vote was much closer. McKinley won 51% of the vote to Bryan's 47%. Many factors led to Bryan's defeat. He was unable to win a single state in the populous and industrial Northeast. Laborers feared the free silver idea as much as their bosses. While inflation would help the debt-ridden, mortgage-paying farmers, it could hurt the wage-earning, rent-paying factory workers. In a sense, the election came down to a clash between the interests of the city versus country, and by 1896, the urban forces won. Bryan's campaign marked the last time a major party attempted to win the White House by exclusively courting the rural vote. The economy in 1896 was also on the upswing. Had the election occurred in the heart of the Panic of 1893, the results may have been different. Farm prices were rising in 1896, albeit slowly, and the Populist Party fell apart with Bryan's loss. Although they continued to nominate candidates, most of their membership reverted to the major parties. The ideas, however, did endure. Although the free silver issue died, the graduated income tax, direct election of senators, initiative, referendum, recall, and the secret ballot were all later enacted. These issues were kept alive by the next standard bearers of the reform, the Progressives. The Progressives. The turn of the 20th century was an age of reform. Urban reformers and populists had already done much to raise attention to the nation's most pressing problems. America in 1900 looked nothing like America in 1850, yet those in power seemed to be applying the same old strategies to complex new problems. The populists had tried to effect change by capturing the presidency in 1896, but had failed. The progressives would succeed where the populists could not. The progressives were urban, northeastern, educated, middle-class, Protestant, reform-minded men and women. There was no official progressive party until 1912, but progressivism had already swept the nation. It was more a movement than a political party, and there were adherents to the philosophy in each major party. There were 3 progressive presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt and Taft were Republicans, and Wilson was a Democrat. What united the movement was a belief that the laissez-faire, social Darwinist outlook of the Gilded Age was morally and intellectually wrong. Progressives believed that people and government had the power to correct abuses produced by nature and the free market. The results were astonishing. Seemingly every aspect of society was touched by progressive reform. Worker and consumer issues were addressed. Conservation of natural resources was initiated, and the plight of the urban poor was confronted. National political movements such as temperance and women's suffrage found allies in the progressive movement. The era produced a host of national and state regulations, plus 4 amendments to the Constitution. The single greatest factor that fueled the progressive movement in America was urbanization. For years, educated, middle-class women had begun the work of reform in the nation's cities. Underlying this new era of reform was a fundamental shift in philosophy away from social Darwinism. Why accept hardship and suffering as simply the result of natural selection? Humans can and have adapted their physical environments to suit their purposes. Individuals need not accept injustices as the law of nature if they can think of a better way. Philosopher William James called this new way of thinking pragmatism. His followers came to believe that an activist government could be the agent of the public to pursue the betterment of social ills. The social gospel. Protestant churches during the Gilded Age were afraid of losing influence over changes in society. Although the population of America was growing rapidly, there were many empty seats in the pews of urban Protestant churches. Middle-class churchgoers were faithful, but large numbers of workers were starting to lose faith in their local churches. The old-style heaven and hell sermons seemed irrelevant to those who toiled long hours for inadequate pay. Meanwhile, immigration swelled the ranks of Roman Catholic churches. Eastern Orthodox churches and Jewish synagogues were sprouting up everywhere. Many cities reported the loss of Protestant congregations. Out of this concern grew the social gospel movement. Progressive-minded preachers began to tie the teachings of Christianity with contemporary problems. Christian virtue, they declared, demanded a redress of poverty and despair on earth. Many ministers became politically active. Washington Gladden, the most prominent of the social gospel ministers, supported the workers' right to strike in the wake of the great upheaval of 1877. Ministers called for an end to child labor, the enactment of the temperance laws, and civil service reform. Liberal churches, such as the Congregationalists and the Unitarians, led the way, but the movement spread to many sects. The Young Men's Christian Association, or YMCA, and the Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA, were founded by Christian progressives to address the challenges faced by urban youth. Two new sects formed. Mary Baker Eddy founded the Christian Science, a new variation of Christianity whose followers tried to reconcile religion and science. She preached that faith was a means to cure evils such as disease. The Salvation Army crossed the Atlantic from England and provided free soup for the hungry. More of a service organization than a church, the Salvation Army remains a potent force for good in many American cities. Middle-class women who had time and financial resources became particularly active in the arena of progressive social reform. The settlement house movement spread across the country. Women organized and built settlement houses in urban centers where destitute immigrants could go when they had nowhere else to turn. Settlement houses provided family-style cooking, lessons in English, and tips on how to adapt to American culture. The first settlement house began in 1889 in Chicago and was called Hull House. Its organizer, Jane Addams, intended Hull House to serve as a prototype for other settlement houses. By 1900, there were nearly 100 settlement houses in the nation's cities. Jane Addams was considered the founder of social work, a new profession. The changes were profound. Many historians call this period in the history of American religion the Third Great Awakening. Like the first two awakenings, it was characterized by revival and reform. The temperance movement and the settlement house movement were both affected by church activism. The chief difference between this movement and those of an earlier era was location. These changes in religion transpired because of urban realities, underscoring the social impact of the new American city. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire on March 25, 1911, was the deadliest industrial disaster in the history of New York City and resulted in the fourth highest loss of life from an industrial accident in American history. The fire caused the death of 146 garment workers who died from the fire, smoke inhalation, or falling or jumping to their deaths. Most of the victims were recent Jewish and Italian immigrant women aged 16 to 23. Of the victims whose ages are known, the oldest was 43 and the youngest were just 14. Because the managers had locked the doors to the stairwells and exits, a common practice at the time to prevent pilferage and unauthorized breaks, many of the workers who could not escape the burning building jumped to the streets below from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. The fire led to legislation requiring improved factory safety standards and helped spur the growth of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which fought for better working conditions for sweatshop workers. In New York City, a committee on public safety was formed, headed by noted social worker Frances Perkins, to identify specific problems and lobby for new legislation. The subsequent reforms shortened work weeks, instituted mandatory fire escapes, and generally led to safer working conditions. Similar reforms were instituted all around the nation. Child labor. One of the most important reforms of the Progressive era was the elimination of child labor. After its conception in 1904, the National Child Labor Committee, NCLC, focused its attacks on child labor and endorsed the first national anti-child labor bill. Although the bill was defeated, it convinced many opponents of child labor that a solution lay in the cooperation and solidarity between the states. The NCLC called for the establishment of a federal children's bureau that would investigate and report on the circumstances of all American children. In 1912, the NCLC succeeded in passing an act establishing a United States Children's Bureau in the Department of Commerce and Labor. On April 9th, President William Taft signed the act into law. Over the next 30 years, the Children's Bureau would work closely with the NCLC to promote child labor reforms on both the state and national level. In 1915, Pennsylvania Congressman A. Mitchell Palmer, who would go on to be Attorney General, introduced a bill to end child labor in most American mines and factories. President Wilson found it constitutionally unsound, and after the House voted 232 to 44 in favor on February 15, 1915, he allowed it to die in the Senate. Nevertheless, Arthur Link has called it a turning point in American constitutional history because it attempted to establish for the first time, quote, the use of the Commerce Clause commerce power to justify almost any form of federal control over working conditions and wages, unquote. In 1916, Senator Robert L. Owen of Oklahoma and Representative Edward Keating of Colorado introduced the NCLC-backed Keating-Owen Act, which prohibited shipment in interstate commerce of goods manufactured or processed by child labor. The bill passed by a margin of 337 to 46 in the House and 50 to 12 in the Senate and was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson. However, in 1918, the law was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision in Hammer versus Dagenhart. The court, while acknowledging child labor as a social evil, felt that the Keating-Owen Act overstepped Congress's power to regulate trade. The NCLC then switched its strategy to passing of a federal constitutional amendment. In 1924, Congress passed the Child Labor Amendment. However, by 1932, only 6 states had voted for ratification, while 24 had rejected the measure. Today, the amendment is technically still pending and has been ratified by a total of 28 states, requiring the ratification of 10 more for its incorporation into the Constitution. In 1938, the National Child Labor Committee threw its support behind the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, which included child labor provisions designed by the NCLC. The act prohibits any interstate commerce of goods produced through oppressive child labor. The act defines oppressive child labor as any form of employment for children under age 16 and any particularly hazardous occupation for children ages 16 to 18. This definition excludes agricultural labor and instances in which the child is employed by his or her guardians, such as in a family shop. On June 25, 1938, after the approval of Congress, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the bill into law. The FLSA remains the primary federal child labor law to this day. Students who want to work during the school year must first apply for a work permit from their school. Although they may see this as an inconvenience, it is, in fact, an important protection against the child labor abuses of the past. Education reform. The progressives embraced education reform. Employers wanted a better educated workforce to fill increasingly technical jobs. Classical liberals believed that public education was the cornerstone of any democracy. A government based on public participation would be imperiled if large numbers of uneducated masses voted unwisely. Church leaders and modern liberals who were concerned for the welfare of children believed that a strong education was not only appropriate but an inalienable right. Critics of child labor practices wanted longer mandatory school years. After all, if a child was in school, he or she would not be in the factory. In 1870, about half of the nation's children received no formal education whatsoever. Although many states provided for a free public education for children between the ages of 5 and 21, economic realities kept many children working in mines, factories, or on the farm. Only 6 states had compulsory education laws at this point, and most were for only several weeks per year. Massachusetts was the leader in tightening laws. By 1890, all children in Massachusetts between the ages of 6 and 10 were required to attend school at least 20 weeks per year. These laws were much simpler to enact than to enforce. Truant officers were necessary to chase down offenders. Private and religious schools had to be monitored to ensure quality standards similar to public schools. Despite resistance, acceptance of mandatory elementary education began to spread. By the turn of the century, such laws were universal throughout the North and West, with only the South lagging behind. There, under the laws of Jim Crow, the public schools in operation in the South were entirely segregated by race in 1900. Mississippi became the last state to require elementary education in 1918. Other reforms began to sweep the nation. Influenced by German immigrants, kindergartens sprouted in urban areas, beginning with St. Louis in 1873. The most famous reformer of the time was John Dewey. Dewey applied pragmatic thinking to education. Rather than having students memorize facts or formulas, Dewey proposed learning by doing. He emphasized the importance of free public education in promoting democracy. Dewey also championed the development of normal schools, colleges that specialized in preparation of future teachers. By 1900, 1 in 5 public school teachers had a college degree. More and more high schools were built in the last 3 decades of the 1800s. During that period, the number of public high schools increased from 160 to 6,000, and the nation's illiteracy rate was cut nearly in half. Despite the expansion of high schools, still only 4% of American children between the ages of 14 and 17 actually attended a high school. For most Americans, an 8th grade education was sufficient. Higher education was changing as well. In general, the number of colleges increased, owing to the creation of public land-grant colleges by the states and private universities sponsored by philanthropists such as Stanford and Vanderbilt. Opportunities for women to attend college were also on the rise. Mount Holyoke, Smith, Vassar, Wellesley, and Bryn Mawr colleges provided a liberal arts education equivalent to their males-only counterparts. By 1910, 40% of the nation's college students were female, despite the fact that many professions were still closed to women. Although nearly 47% of the nation's colleges accepted women, African American attendance at white schools was virtually non-existent. Black colleges such as Howard, Fisk, and Atlanta University rose to meet this need. Political reform. The populist movement influenced progressivism, especially in the promotion of political reform. While rejecting the call for free silver, the progressives embraced the political reforms of secret ballot, initiative, referendum, and recall. Most of these reforms were on the state level. Under the governorship of Robert La Follette, Wisconsin became a laboratory for many of these reforms, enacting them first so other states could see an example to copy. The populist ideas of an income tax and direct election of senators became the 16th Amendment and 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution under progressive direction. Reformers went further by trying to root out urban corruption by introducing new models of city government. The city commission and the city manager systems removed important decision-making from politicians and placed it at the hands of skilled technicians. Such reforms did a great deal to reduce the power of political machines like New York's Tammany Hall. Environmentalism. As America grew, Americans were destroying its natural resources. Farmers were depleting the nutrients of the overworked soil. Miners removed layer after layer of valuable topsoil, leading to catastrophic erosion. Everywhere, forests were shrinking and wildlife was becoming scarcer. The growth of cities brought a new interest in preserving the old lands for future generations. Dedicated to saving the wilderness, the Sierra Club formed in 1892. John Muir, the president of the Sierra Club, worked valiantly to stop the sale of public lands to private developers. At first, most of his efforts fell on deaf ears. Then Theodore Roosevelt moved into the Oval Office, and his voice was finally heard. Roosevelt was an avid outdoorsman. He hunted, hiked, and camped wherever possible. He believed that living in nature was good for the body and soul. Although he proved willing to compromise with Republican conservatives on many issues, he was dedicated to protecting the nation's public lands. The first measure he backed was the New Lands Reclamation Act of 1902. This law encouraged developers and homesteaders to inhabit lands that were useless without massive irrigation works. The lands were sold at cheap price if the buyer assumed the cost of irrigation and lived on the land for at least 5 years. The government then used the revenue to irrigate additional lands. Over 1 million barren acres were rejuvenated under this program. John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt were more than political acquaintances. In 1903, Roosevelt took a vacation by camping with Muir in Yosemite National Park. The two agreed that making efficient use of public lands was not enough. Certain wilderness areas should simply be left undeveloped. Under an 1891 law that empowered the president to declare national forests and withdraw public lands from development, Roosevelt began to preserve wilderness areas. By the time he left office, 150 million acres had been deemed national forests, forever safe from the axe and saw. This amounted to 3 times the total protected lands since the law was enacted. In 1907, Congress passed a law blocking the president from protecting additional territory in 6 western states. In typical Roosevelt fashion, he signed the bill into law, but not before protecting 16 million additional acres in those 6 states. Conservation fever spread among urban intellectuals. By 1916, there were 16 national parks with over 300,000 annual visitors. The Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, groups originally founded in England, formed to give urban youths a greater appreciation of nature. Memberships in conservation and wildlife societies soared. Teddy Roosevelt distinguished himself as the greatest presidential advocate of the environment since Thomas Jefferson. Much damage had been done, but America's beautiful, abundant resources were given a new lease on life.
Conclusion. When the United States became involved in the First World War, attention was diverted from domestic issues and progressivism went into the decline. While unable to solve the problems of every American, the progressive era set the stage for the 20th century trend of an activist government trying to assist its people. The progressives were involved in so many different areas of life that sometimes it can be hard to pin down a definition. Based on what the progressives of history did, what do you think? What does it mean to be progressive?